This is Alex Traiman. I'm standing here on the hallowed grounds of the Birkenau extermination camp as between 10 and 15,000 participants from around the world, Jews and non-Jews, all get set to take the 3.5-kilometer march from the Auschwitz concentration camp to the Birkenau extermination center, also part of the Auschwitz concentration complex, where approximately 1 million Jews met their deaths during World War II. One of the most unspeakable, unthinkable tragedies of modern civilization. We're seeing now on the camera the various delegations in front of the Arbeit macht frei entrance to the Auschwitz concentration camp. That sign means work will set you free. Over 15,000 people gathered from all over the world. Delegates coming from the United States, Israel, Australia, Canada, South America, Romania, Poland, and many other countries, all to remember the atrocities that took place here and in a series of other concentration camps and extermination camps where over 6 million Jews met their deaths, approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe at that time. For many of us, we have learned about the Holocaust in schools, been to museums, seen pictures, movies, and heard testimony from Holocaust survivors. But to stand on the grounds in which such a tragedy took place is something that is really beyond words, very difficult to describe the emotions that run through one's mind, one's heart, and one's soul when seeing with your own eyes the very place where the systematic murder, annihilation, genocide of the Jewish people took place. To think about how a people so sophisticated as the Germans were able to assemble, facilitate, and execute such horrific crime while the rest of Europe and the free world stood by for years, with so many Jews being singled out just for being Jewish. This is the 31st International March of the Living. The March of the Living is an annual education program bringing individuals from around the world to Poland and Israel to study the history of the Holocaust and to examine the roots of prejudice, intolerance, and hatred. Since its inception in 1988, close to 300,000 alumni from 52 countries have marched down this same 3-kilometer path leading from Auschwitz to Birkenau on Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, as a tribute to all the victims of the Holocaust. The universal goal of the International March of the Living is to help inspire our participants fight indifference, racism, and injustice by witnessing the atrocities of the Holocaust. Our hope is that the program will help strengthen Jewish identity, connections to Israel, and build a community of future Jewish leaders. Each year, the March of the Living is joined by thousands of Jewish teens, adults, and survivors from around the world, along with other people from diverse faiths and backgrounds. A key element of the program is the unique participation of Holocaust survivors. By being able to hear survivors' stories in the very places where they unfolded is an experience of a lifetime to remember the past and ensure the future. The years approaching are some of the last that survivors will be able to join us, making participation in this trip more timely and relevant than ever before. As Elie Wiesel once said, "When you listen to a witness, you become a witness." The participants of the March of the Living become the living testimony for future generations. And to think about the over 1 million Jews that were killed only on this site in the Birkenau extermination camp is something that sends shivers through the hearts and souls of every human, and particularly every Jew. And today on Yom HaShoah, as we remember the dead, we also look forward to the upcoming Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, Independence Day festivals that take place just 1 week from now in the state of Israel. And to recognize that that state, in part, came from the ashes of the Holocaust, of course, also from the 1 million+ refugees of Arab and North African nations that were expelled from their homes and also emigrated to the State of Israel. But from these two really unspeakable actions was the State of Israel born. And to know that today that there is a state and a government and an IDF, an Israeli Defense Force, particularly with an Air Force, that is there to protect Jews wherever they were, wherever they are in the world. To see these train tracks standing right next to me, and to realize that the nations of the world, with air forces of their own, chose not to bomb the train tracks, which led Jews to their eventual deaths here at Birkenau and at the other death camps, really gives pause to the role that modern society plays in eliminating hate, racism, and particularly genocide. The 3.5 kilometer march will bring Jews and non-Jews from all around the world together in what is an absolutely unifying and meaningful experience. And for those participating at home, watching this broadcast, it should be a call to participate on the March of the Living in the future. To date, close to 300,000 participants have taken place on the march, which takes place on Israeli Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, just 1 week before Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut, the Israeli Memorial Days and Independence Days. Just behind us is the main entrance to the gate to Birkenau. We're standing just meters from the train tracks, which brought Jews to the Birkenau extermination camp, where many of them were selected immediately for the gas chambers. The gas chambers would take anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes to murder all those that were within them with Zyklon B gas, a pesticide meant to kill bugs in farms, but when concentrated also was used to gas Jews to death in many of the concentration and death camps. We were just in one of the death camps in the Auschwitz Center in Birkenau. There were close to 2 million people killed in the various Auschwitz facilities, including Birkenau. Yet there were other death camps as well. We go now to Shmuel Rosenman.
In 1939, 8 years ago, World War II began with a brutal invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. This attack was followed by 6 years of unimaginable brutality and the most deadly war in the history of the world. A war that spelled the end of so many Jewish communities throughout Europe. In taking part in the March of the Living on this Yom HaShoah, you are marching at a time when growing wave of anti-Semitism is yet again sweeping the world. But in truth, anti-Semitism never really did disappear. It simply lay barely hidden under the surface, waiting for the right time to strike again. And strike it did, in deadly fashion. At the Etz Chaim synagogue in Pittsburgh last year, and just a few days ago, at the Chabad synagogue in San Diego, on the last day of Passover. We recognize that the Jewish people are not the only victims of violence and terror. We stand side by side with victims senseless terrors anywhere in the world, be it in church in Sri Lanka, or in mosque in New Zealand, or during Rwanda genocide that happened some 25 years ago. But today, we gather together here in Auschwitz-Birkenau on Yom HaShoah. We are here to mourn our 6 million ancestors, brothers and sisters, 1/3 of the entire Jewish people, and 2/3 of all European Jewry were murdered in the most terrible genocide in all of history. And we proclaim to our enemies with loud and clear voice, we shall not be defeated. We will return here, year after year, to to raise our voice against anti-Semitism and indeed against all forms of racism and hatred, whether the victims are Jewish, Christians, Muslims, or from any other group. A survivor of Auschwitz once said, "There is the only one thing worse than Auschwitz. That is, if the world ever forget there was an Auschwitz. We promise to never let that happen. And we pledge to keep reminding the world about the horrors of Auschwitz and its lessons that we dare never, ever forget." And it is from this very place, from this blood-soaked earth, we call upon the world leaders, all decision makers, all the media, to say loud and clear, no to anti-Semitism, no to racism. Ladies and gentlemen, young people, in few moments from now, you will be following in the footsteps of other 300,000 young people who participated in the March of the Living. Let this be your first step on a lifetime journey of fighting hatred and injustice and creating a world where every single human life is valued. After the shofar sound, we'll start our march.
The march is now underway. It has begun the 2019 march. Started with words from Dr. Shmuel Rosenman, the chairman of the March of the Living. The delegation's now moving from the main sign, the Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. You see the delegations, they're led, the Israeli delegation by chairman of the Jewish Agency, Bogi Herzog, and U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, also former Chief Rabbi Lau, and many different diplomats and delegates from different nations. You see there United Nations ambassadors leading, led by Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations, Danny Danon. Also put together by the American Zionist Movement. This is the second year that the AZM, together with the International March of the Living, has brought delegations to the March of the Living. This is the 31st annual March of the Living. For myself, it's been particularly difficult. My first time here in Poland. My grandparents on my father's side, Holocaust survivors. My grandmother liberated on a death march from Majdanek in July of 1945. My grandfather was in a labor camp in Skarżysko. And so it was extremely personal for me to come here and experience for myself, to see with my own two eyes, feel with my heart the atrocities that took place here, and to understand with greater meaning what the words "never again" mean. And today, close to 15,000 individuals, many of them students from all over the world, coming not only to see with their own eyes, but to become the next generation of witnesses that will be able to share the atrocities of the Holocaust with their communities, with their families, God willing in the future with their children, in order to pass on the memory of what took place here. If one does not come to these places themselves, it's very, very difficult to understand. One of the things that I learned on this tour is that the tour itself is one of the strongest Jewish identity building initiatives that the Jewish people have today. We're listening to the preparations for the ceremony which will take place in less than an hour from now at the back of the Birkenau Extermination Center, where the juxtaposition between such atrocious death will meet the continuation of Jewish life. For me, honestly, one of the most special privileges I've had in my career, in my life, to speak to Holocaust survivors. So touching, so moving, the horrors that took place here, so inexplicable. And yet, the March of the Living is not a march of death, it is a march of life. It is a march that celebrates coming up from the ashes, literally picking up from the piles of dust, crushed bones, skin and hair of the Holocaust, and using those as seeds to rebuild the Jewish nation, both around the world and also in the state of Israel, which is a guarantee to the Jewish people that atrocities like the Holocaust will never, ever happen again. One of the major themes of this year's march is to say no to anti-Semitism. There's been a resurgence of anti-Semitism particularly in the last 2 years, and particularly during this last year, 2 horrific shootings taking place exactly 6 months apart, both in Pittsburgh and now more recently in Poway, San Diego. And this year's march, more than ever, is to express the importance of recognizing the roots of anti-Semitism and making certain that they never evolve into the horrific tragedies that took place in these very hallowed places just 80 years ago. As we see the broadcast, you can see in the back the sign, "Say No to Anti-Semitism." As students are marching, students such a big part of this delegation, and as we heard from Alan, the tremendous importance of telling the stories that took place here, as there are a diminishing number of first-hand witnesses. But as Elie Wiesel said so poignantly, everyone who speaks to a witness becomes a witness. And you really feel that the March of the Living is about creating new generations of witnesses that will not only retell the stories, but will be able to intensify and exponentially grow the quantity of the message of the Holocaust, even if they're unable to speak with the same quality as those that experience it themselves. There's really no way that even a participant in the March of the Living can know what a Holocaust survivor truly experienced. Yet, to be able to take even some piece of that within you is a tremendous piece of Jewish history, Jewish identity. So you hear in the background Yehuda Polacker preparing for the ceremony that will take place here to celebrate life and the rebirth of the Jewish people, the life of the March of the Living. Just some quick Holocaust facts and dates for those that are listening. The Holocaust began in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and the war ended in 1945 when the Nazis were defeated by the Allied powers. During the Holocaust, 1/3 of the Jewish population at the time was murdered. 2/3 of the 9 million Jews living in Europe before the Holocaust were murdered. A total of 11 million people were murdered in those 12 years of Holocaust, and 6 million out of them were Jews. And Auschwitz and Birkenau have been turned into a memorial site, a museum, since 1947, and over 500,000 people visit Auschwitz every year. There was over 1 million children were killed by the Nazis, Jewish children. About 2 million Jews were killed, Russian Jews were killed. The number of camps, prisons, and other facilities of incarceration within Germany and the lands it occupied were 40,000. The extermination camps were 6: Auschwitz, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those ones in Poland. there was approximately 1,100 ghettos. Auschwitz itself was first constructed to hold Polish political prisoners who began to arrive in May of 1940. In the end, more people died in Auschwitz than either the British and the Americans put together suffered during World War II combined. From March 1st, 1942 to November 22nd, 1943, Auschwitz was subordinated to Rudolf Höss, the commandant of the entire complex of Auschwitz camps. He was arrested in 1946. He was convicted of murder and he was hanged at the camp. And we had the opportunity to see the gallows in which Rudolf Höss was hanged. The division of Auschwitz into 3 lesser camps was created for different functions. The Auschwitz I focused on central offices, warehouses, and workshops. Auschwitz II, which is Birkenau where we are, was the center for the extermination of Jews. And then Auschwitz III camp was to hire the prisoners' workforce. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz. Prisoners welcomed them as genuine liberators. The paradox of history caused that soldiers who were formerly representatives of Stalinist totalitarianism brought freedom to the prisoners of Nazi totalitarianism. This year's delegation also features, for the first time, a delegation of the United States government led by U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman and U.S. Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism worldwide Elon Carr. Hopefully they'll join us a little bit later. Also, there's a special delegation of United Nations ambassadors and delegates, which is led by Israel's permanent representative to the United Nations, Danny Danon. The president of Romania is here. There's a special delegation of the Greek Orthodox Church, as one of the themes of this year's march is to remember the Jews of Salonika. Jews of Salonika had an especially interesting story in which about 87% of them were murdered during the war, and the second highest percentage of any country next to Poland. And the Jews of Saloniki had to buy their freedom from Nazi Germany, which later turned out to be a ransom payment that was useless. And one of the most amazing, mind-boggling details of the Saloniki Jews was that they actually had to purchase their tickets to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Again, very difficult to put into words the emotions that one feels when they speak to Holocaust survivors, myself welling up in tears a few times listening to the stories, not just in hearing the words, but also just seeing the stories that were in their eyes, which are so much deeper than any words can tell. And understanding that the Jewish people are a people that are committed not just to remembering the past, but are committed to life and committed to building the future. And to be part now of the growing modern state of Israel, which is turning in our lifetime from a developing nation into a modern superpower, economic superpower, military superpower, it gives hope that the atrocities of the Holocaust will never happen again. And yet at the same time, atrocities still taking place around the world, even just to Israel's north in Syria, a horrific civil war in which millions were killed, some by chemical gas, which definitely evokes comparisons and some similarities to the gassing of Jews in concentration camps, although not on the scale, but still horrific atrocities still taking place in the world, and in many ways wondering if the lessons of the Holocaust are truly learned. We're now, unfortunately, in 2019, dealing with growing acts of anti-Semitism. There was a deadly shooting in San Diego and at the Chabad of Poway. Rory Kay murdered for being Jewish, taking a bullet which was intended for the rabbi, Yisrael Goldstein, who lost a finger. Several others injured, including children, which also took place just 6 months to the day after the murder of 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, just two of a growing number of anti-Semitic incidents. ADL just released a report showing that anti-Semitic incidents are once again on the rise. And as we spoke about earlier in the broadcast, the internet has become a haven for anti-Semitism, not only in the content itself that's produced, the news content, but especially if one takes a look at the comments that are below articles, particularly articles about Israel. You can see virulent anti-Semitic comments made by individuals, shameless comments of anti-Semitism. And it really explains the importance of the march, not only for Jews to come and to memorialize and to see firsthand the sites and the commemorative museum that demonstrates what took place in the Holocaust, but really for everybody, because it's only Holocaust education that can really quell anti-Semitism. When people really see for themselves what happens when anti-Semitism goes unchecked, what happens when people with power, governments, those with guns, become anti-Semitic, how quickly mass tragedies can take place. It is so difficult. And the March of the Living itself is such a touching experience, one of the most important identity-building experiences that one can possibly participate in. And today, close to 15,000 people marching after touring Auschwitz, and you can see that they are beginning to arrive now, already walking on the train tracks. We see the first delegation entering now the March of the Living 2019 sign, stopping under the main gate of the Birkenau extermination camp. We hear Cantor Shai Abramson, the chief cantor of the Israeli Defense Forces, practicing the Kaddish that we sing on Yom Kippur, the Day of Judgment. And certainly the Holocaust was a time of tremendous judgment for the Jewish people. And it's so difficult to understand how such tragedies would take place, and then how so soon after the Holocaust, the miracles of the birth of the State of Israel could take place. The State of Israel certainly not born because of the Holocaust, and yet in some ways, and it's so hard to understand, the Holocaust had to take place in order for the creation of the modern State of Israel to be born. And that's the lesson of from death to life, from ashes to rebirth. And that the State of Israel remembers and never forgets the horrific tragedy that took place is so important to our existence. And similarly, the expulsion of over 1 million Jews from their homes in Muslim nations and Arab countries and North African countries with the foundation of the state. The State of Israel is a state of refugees. And only now are we starting to see growing numbers of children and grandchildren that were born in the State of Israel itself. And we see thriving Jewish communities around the world, in the United States, in England, France, South Africa, Ukraine, Argentina, Panama, Mexico, Canada, and elsewhere. And yet, sometimes we still struggle to understand the meaning and purpose of being Jews in a modern world, in a world which often seems to value religion less and less. And yet so many Jews have found a way to positively identify with not only the religion of Judaism, but with the culture of Judaism, and recognize that this Judaism which we still carry on our backs is a Judaism which has been passed on for thousands of years through thick and thin, through tragedies that in some ways mirrored the Holocaust, certainly motivated by the same themes of anti-Semitism. And yet the story of the Jewish people is a story of survival and rebirth. And today the Jewish nation, strong, thriving nation, yet still one that is challenged. Today we see that modern forms of anti-Semitism are turned into anti-Israel sentiment. And many today will boastfully state that questioning Israel's policies is not anti-Semitism, and yet we see that the founders of the BDS movement themselves are connected in many ways with numerous links to those that organize terror attacks in Israel and around the world, the terrorist organizations. The Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel released its Terrorist in Suits report earlier this year that demonstrated some of these connections. And it's very difficult to explain to people why Israel needs to exist, and difficult to explain that Israel is one of the most liberal nations in the world and should be supported particularly by those claiming to be carrying the banner of liberalism in today's world. And as Natan Sharansky pointed out, there are three ways of identifying whether activities and statements towards Israel are anti-Semitic, and he called them the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds of demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. We saw just recently the demonization of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the New York Times. A grotesque picture of Netanyahu's face on the face of a dog with a Jewish star under his neck, leading a blind President Trump with a kippah on his head. And we understand that propaganda was such an important part of the systematic programming of the German people to detest the Jewish people so much that they would participate in a Holocaust only a few years later. We see now the pace car and the banner arriving towards the ceremony center here at Birkenau, to songs being sung by Cantor Shai Abramson, chief cantor of the Israeli Defense Forces, media gathering, beginning to gather over here. The March of the Living takes special efforts to bring media, not just Israeli media and American media, but international media as well, in order to magnify the voices of those that speak at the March of the Living, in order to hear the experiences of Holocaust survivors that are now returning to Auschwitz, some of them for the first time, some of them multiple times, in order to relive and retell their stories to those arriving for the first time, and also to speak with some of the diplomats that have attended.
But to come here and to see it is simply devastating, and to witness the cruelty that mankind is capable of perpetrating. And so we're very proud that the United States is represented here with a large delegation of ambassadors, 5 ambassadors, and I'm here as well. And this really states our commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, not only to remembering the 6 million murdered, but to confronting anti-Semitism in all its forms, in every place in the world. That is the policy of the United States, and that's what we're doing.
And we are seeing now growing incidents of anti-Semitism. The ADL just putting out a report showing that anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise. 2 deadly shootings in synagogues over the past 6 months, both in Pittsburgh and most recently in San. Tell me about your experience on the march.
It's very hard experience, but it's something that everyone should do. My boys have done it, and me and my wife have said for years that we need to do it. And this year we've done it. This is a pilot that the IAC is doing, and we hope that from now on we're going to send many groups, young adults, everyone that really, every Jew should be here and experience it, because as much as I thought I understood before, this is a completely different perspective.
What do you gain?
What you gain by being here? It's just you walk in the footsteps of this individual. You see, you touch the buildings, you understand. Although, again, we were all educated, we all understood what was going on here, but personal experience is personal experience. So there is nothing.
History and biography, and for many reasons was hard for me all the years, and this year I thought it would be a right and respectful opportunity to come together with our chairman, Mr. Herzog, and a group of our workers, both on a personal journey and also with the organization that I think stands for everything that has to do with the memory and the future of the Jewish people.
Can you tell me, I know it's so difficult, but can you tell me a little bit of the emotion that one feels when they're on the march?
Keren Hayesod is one of Israel's historic national institutions, established in 1920. And together with our partner national institutions like the Jewish Agency and others, we help connect Israel with the Jewish communities around the world and our friends of Israel around the world. And we raise funds in order to carry out Jewish Agency programs that help bring Jews on Aliyah and absorb them, and also help with the weaker sections of society, especially in the periphery, and the disadvantaged and the underprivileged, in order to strengthen Israeli society.
Dehumanized, made parts of a machine process of death. It's just unfathomable, actually. It's very difficult to understand, and it's very sad. But then you see the young groups singing and chanting and meeting each other and making new friends, and you realize this is actually not the site of a defeat. I mean, this is obviously a terrible place where terrible things happened, but the fact that we're here makes this the site of a tremendous victory. And I think that's always the feeling one comes away with here. At least it's the same feeling I had last year. Someone asked me for a photograph here last year, and I tried to find one to give them. And I was smiling in the few photographs I had, and it was just bizarre. They said, "How are you smiling at this death camp?"
Thousands of people pouring in along the train tracks of Birkenau. And you really get the feeling of life along train tracks which once led Jews to their deaths.
We are from Florida, originally from South America, from Venezuela, and I'm coming here to march for the living, to dispute hate, and make a better world.
Remember what's happened and see and join with the other Australians on this marvellous march.
Is this your first time on the march?
Yes.
And what's the
being on this march? It just gives us a lot of hope and a lot of strength.
How many students did you bring?
No students, we're an adult program.
On the other side of the world in Australia, but when you're here, it's like being able to connect with it's a strange thing to say, with the spirits of my family from Bialystok when we visited in Treblinka, and just to pay the respects and just show the souls that we are their legacy and their stories will be told, so that this never happens to us, and hopefully help.
And 3 Muslims, and we've been in Poland for 5 days, and we were at Auschwitz yesterday and Birkenau and other sites, and we've come to learn and join March for the Living.
What are some of your takeaways?
Yesterday was a day of despair, and today is a day of hope.
Please explain.
Well, yesterday we walked through the gates there, and it was bleak and dark and without
lives that were lost in the Holocaust, and we're doing it because we don't want any of those those millions of people to ever be forgotten, and we're doing this so they're in our memories, and we want to make sure that nothing like this can ever happen again, and we become more empathetic and better as individuals. So it's important that we go on this march to broadcast that.
And your students?
And just to be here where it all unfolded, it's surreal, and it's hard to put into words. But I'm so thankful to have this opportunity to be here with so many 15,000 people on this wonderful afternoon, and to be able to march from.
Stand up, be counted, and do something. I want the young people, the next generation, to do something, to take their experience on this journey of the March of the Living. Make memories you'll never forget. Make a commitment you'll never deny, and do something. Do something to be a catalyst for change. You deserve a better world. Your children deserve a better world. My children, my grandchildren. So as a mom, as a grandmother, and as president of the March of the Living, I'm asking you to take this journey and turn it into something meaningful.